I also found, through the Freedom of Information Act, a lot of correspondence between my grandfather Platt, Tom's father, and the War Department, because after the war was over, a lot of these men were buried in temporary graves, which I had never known before, and I don't know why I would know it, but it certainly has never been mentioned. And I found that Tom was moved 4 times before he finally was buried at the National Cemetery in the Pacific. It's called the Punch Bowl, or just Punch Bowl. So I really wanted to see Punch Bowl, and I did. It's a very moving place, a very beautiful place. And I found out just about every detail possible of how he died and how he was buried. So I attended a Veterans Day service at Punch Bowl. Never been to a service like that before, so maybe that's why I found it so moving. But it was the service down in this big, vast. It's a defunct crater, so it's sort of like this long stretch of beautiful green, because it's been inert for a long time. And then at the top they have this big statue of this peace goddess, she's called, and there's a small chapel. It's an outdoor chapel. I mean, everything about Hawaii was so exotic to me, northerner, but all these open air things, but this was extremely moving. So I find it hard to read this passage, but I find it, the reason it's hard to read is because it's very moving. I drove back to the cemetery as if pulled by a magnet. Nothing else on this beautiful playground of an island seemed to interest me. The crowds were mostly gone. I drove to the top of the crater near the Peace Goddess and parked. I got out of my car and looked down at the expanse of burials beneath me once again. From a near distance I could hear a faint singing. It seemed to be coming from the little chapel, which had been empty when I had passed through it earlier in the day. Young uniformed cadets had brought the many memorial wreaths, floral circles of bright reds and brilliant whites, up to the chapel from where the ceremony had taken place. There were so many that they nearly blocked the entry. Aside from the singing, I heard sobbing. I walked silently to the back of the chapel. In the front, 2 American flags hung on either side of a green marble altar backed by red marble and a gold cross. 6 polished wooden pews on either side completed this open-air place of prayer. In the back pew, a woman about my age sobbed almost uncontrollably. A girl I assumed to be her daughter sat beside her, also weeping. The woman groped the air as if she didn't know what to do with her hands or with her body, which undulated in grief. At last her arms came to rest around her daughter, and she held on to her, rocking her, her sobs filling the space. What was her story, I wondered. In the front pew an old Hawaiian sat, his military cap on his head, a string of beads around his neck. In a high, forlorn tenor, he sang Amazing Grace, the trembling song of a sorrowful old man. When he was finished, he wiped tears from his eyes and continued. He sang, How Great Thou Art, Just a Closer Walk with You, and others. I realized that this man was singing in hopes of comforting this woman whose griefs filled this great space and all the air that flowed through it. Ahead of me, a brawny man in black t-shirt that read Big Wave Beach, Hawaii, sat with his head bowed. His thick gray hair was matted from where his hat seemed always to have been. I thought, Vietnam, but I had no way of knowing. He remained still and silent as the old man sang and the young woman wept. Familiar tears returned to my eyes once again. I felt this as a place of indescribable grief and a place of indescribable solace. At last I left, those mournful sounds fading as I walked further from them. The day that had begun with such a heavy rain had cleared. and we had sat through the service under the strong tropical sun. But now, as I returned to my car, rain began to fall once again. The sun was still shining. I looked to the east and saw a brilliant rainbow. I understand that Hawaii has many rainbows, but this was the first I had seen since I had come, and it was probably the biggest, brightest rainbow I had ever seen in my life. It arced over the cemetery in perfect poetry. I walked back over to Tom's grave. As I came near to it, I noticed that if I stood in just the right place, I could make the rainbow end at his decorated grave. I did that and took a snapshot with the rainbow's end lined up directly above his resting place. It made me happy to do that, but I knew full well that any one of those thousands of graves could become the marker at the end of a shimmering Pacific rainbow. All anyone would have to do is to be there and to stand in the right place, according to the stone of the one they had come to remember. So from what I have just read, it seems like the book was really a search for Tom, which in many ways it was, but the book is really about war, and I learned a great deal about how war affects the families who lose somebody in the war. World War II was, I think, a very unconscious war in terms of how this kind of experience was processed. These people came out of this war and they all got married, which is what my parents did. For my father, it was a great resolution to his quest of many years to get my mother to marry him. And for my mother, I think it was much more complicated. I think of this book as completely anti-war. There's not much detail in there about battles or the horrors of war, but I think a lot of the horrors of war are psychological. So there was, in the end, a lot not to tell about this war, and I think my father didn't see much action, but he was a really brave man. So I hope you are interested to read the book, and if you do, I hope you experience some thoughts about your own family and how they may have been affected by this war or any of the wars that we've been fighting ever since. Thank you very much.